Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today, first of all, please subscribe to my channel. It won't take more than 3 seconds, I swear. And second of all, we are today going to study the third exponent of the social contract theory. That is a very famous French philosopher, J.J. Rousseau, and he lived in the pre-revolutionary France because the revolution in France came in 1789. So he has expounded his theory on social contract in his two famous books. The first one is The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and secondly, The Social Contract. We are going to look at his concept of state of nature, what was the contract, and how his concept of sovereignty actually, and what was the general will which he expounded and advocated in his theory of social contract, and finally, how Rousseau's theory of social contract influenced other countries and revolutions, and at the end, we will criticize his theory. Now, regarding his concept of the state of nature, he expounded his view on the state of nature in his famous book, The Discourse of Origin of Inequality. Now, what was his concept? We will look. So, his concept was kind of the people's life was peaceful, friendly, there was freedom and equality. So it's kind of a happy life in the state of nature. But this happy life, met a dread end when arose the concept of the private property and the population growth increased and there was a competition of the resources, and now because of the private property concept came into being, so there were quarrels and there were wars started and there were all long disputes. So now this description infers that the Rousseau combined the Locke's and Hobbes concept of state of nature, because he starts with Locke's concept of freedom, equality in the state of nature, a happy life, but he ends with the Hobbes concept of the warlike situation. So at the end of the day, because of these wars and quarrels, the people sought to end the state of nature and come into a contract. Now, what was the contract? In his famous book, The Social Contract, written in 1762, he directly started with his main contract theory rather than telling us about the state of nature. So his famous words are, "Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains." Now this implies that in the state of nature man was free, there was freedom, there was equality and everything. But now man is in chains because of the laws and the customs of the civilized life. So man is now bound with the laws. So what was the contract? Now the people sought to form an association where their life and their own property will be protected with the force of and the power of the whole community, because in the state of nature the man was himself responsible for his own defense and for the security of his property. But now here in this association, the whole community will protect his life and his property. And this was going to be kind of association they will form through the social contract. And according to contract, what was the contract? That man will put all his power, his own self, under the supreme direction of the general will. Now regarding the general, this is called a paradox of freedom, because after the contract the man will be as free as he was before. He will obey himself, not anyone else. Now this is paradox because the statement is in contradict in itself. So let me explain what was the general will actually. Now the general will is the will of the whole community, right? Because Rousseau was an ardent advocate of the direct democracy, and he expounded the direct democracy concept like that found in the Athenians Greek city-states, because in Athens there were this direct democracy. People came together in an assembly and make laws through their votes. So the people made laws and all the peoples were there, although there were certain exceptions in the Athenian concept of the state, in the Athenian city-state of his concept of direct democracy. Now the community will, the will of the whole community was regarded as the general will by Rousseau, and this general will was going to be supreme, and was going to be sovereign. Now, why the general will was sovereign? It's because of the two reasons. The first reason was that the people themselves unconditionally and completely surrendered all of their powers and themselves under the general will, and they came into the contract willingly. And the second one was that the general will was the guardian, the custodian of the general interest of the community. It was going to protect the interest of the whole people because the laws were going to be made by the people. And regarding this, there comes the concept of liberty and equality then. Equality in a sense because all of the people, all of the individuals completely surrender all of their power under the general will. So this is kind of equality, like because all of the individuals are surrendering their complete rights and powers. And the concept of liberty comes here because the individual will be as free as before, and the individual will follow no one but himself. Now, how is this a thing that he will obey only himself? Because the individual is equally participating in the making of laws and kind of the policies through direct democracy. For example, when I myself follow the rules I made for myself, it means that I am obeying myself, none other than but not anybody else. So this is what the concept of liberty was, because the man will be as free as before. He was just going to obey himself, and he surrendered his rights to everybody and none at the same time. So now the thing is that nobody can justifiably disobey the general will. How is this possible? Because when a person was going to disobey the general will, he was not actually going to disobey the general will but himself. He was going to disobey himself, and when he disobeyed and violated the laws, he violated himself, because the laws are actually the reflection of the general will. So that is why when he is actually then punished because of disobeying the general will or the laws, he ordered himself the punishment by disobeying the general will. And it will be made sure that the general will, because the general will is sovereign and supreme, so the general will, that is the community, will make sure that everyone obeys the laws, the general will made by the direct democracy. So here Rousseau propounded popular sovereignty. And what is popular sovereignty actually? Where the people are sovereign, the general population is sovereign. And what is sovereignty? Sovereignty is the absolute and supreme power and authority. So the people will have the authority and power. And regarding the sovereignty is also, one definition of sovereignty is also the supreme power to make laws, to legislate. Now in direct democracy, the people were going to make laws themselves. So regarding the influence of the Rousseau's theory, now also is that Rousseau subsided and subjugated the individual will under the general will. So the influence of the Rousseau's theory. Rousseau has been known as the philosopher of revolution because he was against the arbitrary rule and the despotism and tyranny. And he also was a preacher of popular democracy and modern democracy, political democracy and popular sovereignty, as we have seen. Now, regarding the crux of his revolutionary theory, there were 3 points. First of all, that men are by nature all equal and free. Second, that the government takes its authority from the people because the people have entered freely into the contract. And the third is that the people are sovereign. People have the supreme authority. Now this revolutionary philosophy of Rousseau affected the French revolutionaries, and they embodied this philosophy into their Declaration of Rights of Man 1789, and also Americans were influenced and they included this concept in Americans' Declaration of Independence 1776. We also see that even in Switzerland there is concept of referendum, that is the reflection of Rousseau's theory of popular sovereignty, that is popular consent, popular opinion. So this was the influence of the Rousseau's theory. Now regarding the criticism, one of the major advantage or kind of merit of Rousseau's theory of sovereignty is that he has been regarded as the father of modern democracy, and he expounded the theory of popular sovereignty, that people are supreme, people have the power. And what else is that he had also told us that the government is based upon the consent of the people, the governed, those who are governed. Only if they give consent and they are agreed, the ruler can rule them. Otherwise it won't be possible for the government to have authority. But if you see the defects of his theory, we see that he has given the supreme power and authority to the general will, but the general will actually can be tyrannical, because we are not so sure that the general will be impartial and will include the rights of the whole society, right? So the general will can be tyrannical. And the other thing is that the general will is actually the will of the majority, it's not the will of all, right? So it means there would be a certain part of the society whose will won't be included in the general will. And the other thing is that individuals' will is subordinated to the general will, because the general will is supreme. So by giving this concept, Rousseau has kind of given legitimacy or kind of an opportunity for the despotism or tyrannical absolute monarchy to come into being, because the general will can be tyrannical, right? So this was all about Rousseau's theory of social contract. And if you just actually now we are going to make a comparison between Rousseau, Hobbes and Locke, and then you will it will be kind of summary of the whole three theories, and it's going to be interesting. Now starting with the state of nature, his concept. Now Rousseau's concept of state of nature, as I already described, that it started with Locke's and ended with Hobbes, because the Locke's concept was that of freedom, equality, peaceful and happy life, and that is what Rousseau has also been exponent of. And then Hobbes said that there was a warlike situation, there were disputes, and people were aggressive. That is why the people sought to enter into the state of nature, because there was an insecurity of life and property. This concept was taken by Rousseau as end of his state of nature, because of the concept of the private property, and because of the population growth there came this warlike situation, there were disputes, and so here the concept of Hobbes and Rousseau coincides, right? But there is a contradiction. Locke has a separate concept of the end of the state of nature, because what Locke had stated was that because of there was an inconvenience, there was no explanation, the authentic explanation of the laws of nature. There was no authority to enforce that laws of nature, and thirdly, the people perceived the laws of nature according to their own intellectual capacities. So this was the state of nature. End of state of nature, yes, it's been discussed. Now the concept of sovereignty. Now Rousseau's concept of sovereignty is kind of is just like Hobbes, because in Hobbes' concept of sovereignty, the people willingly, unconditionally give up and surrender all of their rights. Point of Hobbes. Now Rousseau also has this point: the people unconditionally, willingly surrender all of their rights to the community. Here is the difference between Hobbes and Rousseau, that Hobbes said that the people surrender their rights to an assembly of the men or to a single monarch, right? And now Rousseau said that the people will surrender all of their rights to the community and not to a single person or an assembly. But what Locke said was that people will not surrender all of their rights, they will surrender their certain rights and will preserve their certain rights to themselves. So Rousseau propagated a concept of the limited sovereignty, because in Locke's concept of sovereignty, the government will have the limited power, the limited sovereignty, and the people can depose the government, right? So, but the people will have the consent of the people matters, just like the Rousseau said that there will be popular sovereignty, the people's consent matter. But in Hobbes, the people's consent doesn't matter anymore when the sovereign, because the sovereign is all in all, he is the supreme. And regarding the reserved and perpetual exercise of sovereignty, now there is contradiction between Locke and Rousseau. Now Rousseau said that the people will perpetually, continuously exercise their sovereignty by direct democracy, by the general will. But Locke's was of the concept was the people's power or sovereignty will be reserved until and unless the government fails to protect their property and their rights. Only then the people will exercise their absolute sovereignty and they will depose or overthrow the government. Now, regarding the distinguished state from government, both Rousseau and Locke distinguished the state from the government. Now, Rousseau, in a sense that Rousseau told us about that the government will be just will perform the executive portion. Laws will be made by the people through direct democracy, through general will, and the government will just only execute and enforce those laws. But what Locke said is that Locke gave the legislative powers, executive powers to the government, and it was Locke who has been regarded as a philosopher who introduced the concept of separation of powers in government. Because the separation of powers concept we have studied, you would be familiar, is that the judicial power, the judicial department, legislative, and then executive department. So Rousseau did not give legislative powers to the government but to the people, and Locke recognized the three departments of the government: legislative, executive, and judicial. So this was all about the comparison of the three philosophers regarding the social contract theory. Hopefully your concepts will be clear. If any queries, comment below. Thank you so much.